Welcome to the Quiet Reformation. I'm Justin Ryan Boyer. Today on this special episode, Tim Deering talks with Andy Crouch about his new book, The Life We're Looking For.
I'm the furthest thing from hopeless about our current world and our technological world and the technological empire we live in, because we've seen it before. We've seen what happens, the renewal that can happen, and really a very small group of people, albeit somewhat crazy people. So we're just not living on the empire's terms. We're doing this other thing. And then crazy stuff begins to happen.
Andy is partner for theology and culture at Praxis, an organization that works as a creative engine for redemptive business. His writings explore faith, culture, and the image of God in the domains of technology, power, leadership, and the arts. Andy also serves as special counsel for Netzer and lives with his family in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania. His latest book is about reclaiming relationships in a technological world. Check out the links in the show notes for more information. We welcome Andy to the Quiet Reformation.
Hey everybody, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really excited about having Andy Crouch with us today. Andy has been a major influence on our network here at Netzer for a long time, actually since its origin, and has spoken into the ministry in a number of different ways. The books that he's written have influenced all of us across our network and have influenced people across the nation and across the globe. And I also am just so grateful for having had the experience of interaction with Andy over the years, where we get to see and experience together the things that Andy's been contemplating and writing about. We get to see experienced and blessing us as a network and as a ministry and really as friends as well. And so, grateful to have Andy with us. Andy, thanks so much for being on the podcast today.
It's a pleasure. The only problem is you're not in my living room. It would be better if you were in my living room, which is the usual way I see you, Tim.
It would be better because the scones always help.
Exactly.
Yeah. What I didn't do in the introduction here is say that Andy is obviously a gifted author, but he can make a mean scone as well. So, yeah. Andy, you have a book that's dropping as we're speaking here.
It's true. It's true.
Yeah, and you've been working on it. We've been kind of traveling the journey a little bit with you as you've been working on it. I was really blessed to be a part of the prayer team as you were working on that. Can you tell us a little bit? Give us an introduction to the book and any background to get us started here.
Sure. It's wonderful to have it making its way in the world. The name is The Life We're Looking For: Reclaiming a Relationship in a Technological World. And it's a book about what it is to be a person and how hard it is to be a person in the world that we've made using technology and how we could redesign. So as you know, Tim, I've been, these are themes I've been thinking about kind of seriously maybe for 10 or 15 years. And of course, I wrote a book, The Tech-Wise Family, that was very specifically for families and parents. And then a book with my daughter, Amy, My Tech-Wise Life, that was kind of the kid's eye view of it. But this is the bigger picture or the bigger frame, I think, for what families are dealing with. There's much more to be said beyond just what our home life is like. So it's my attempt to do that. And it's both short and kind of ridiculously ambitious in terms of how much I'm trying to squeeze in. So it's nice to have it done.
So a snapshot for everybody. We're going to get into the content of the book here in a minute, but a snapshot for everybody, Andy, of life of a writer. I know you do more than just write. You speak and you lead on a number of those. Yeah. But I love getting a little glimpse into this, and I think it'd be good for others to hear. What does it look like to labor over a book? I mean, it's literally like giving birth in many ways. I know you carry this thing in your womb, and then you have to, bring it bring it to full term. So, give a little snapshot here of what it looks like writing a book.
I will say I'm always reluctant to compare it to labor.
I just got you in trouble quick.
That myself. Also, it takes way more than 9 months. That's the other problem. It's largely despair, anguish, self-loathing, being convinced that I have made a huge mistake, fantasizing about how I could get out of any jurisdiction which my publisher could, sue me and reclaim the advance that they paid. Sometimes literally lying on the floor in just total paralysis. And then eventually I pick myself up from all that, sometimes after days of that. And I'm like, come on, Crouch, you can sit at a screen for 24 minutes, which is what I do. I set a timer for 24 minutes, which is based on this thing called the Pomodoro technique, which is another story. But I set a timer for 24 minutes. I figure I can, even if I get nothing done, I can sit here for 24 minutes. So I do, and almost always within those 24 minutes, something worthwhile has happened. And then the timer goes off. We joke at our house. I walk around the house, which means I literally go out my front door, walk around the house, and come back in my front door, and maybe make some tea. And then I set another 24-minute timer. And on a good day, I have 4 of those sessions. It's just unbelievable how little actual time, how much pain and avoidance there is to get to the actual 4 24-minute sessions in which all the work gets done. But most days when I get myself over the hump of that first 24-minute session, by the end, I have 1,000 words, and you do that. I think this is a 55,000 word book. So you do that 55 times and you have a book, and you nearly died doing it. And your wife and kids and friends who visit your house are really tired of hearing about it. And then it's done.
Andy, I'm so glad you shared this, because I felt like people just needed to hear it. Okay, like, as you know, I've been working at putting together a book myself, and as you've kind of coached me a little bit, it was the most encouraging thing ever to hear. Oh, okay, 4 24-minute periods a day, and you feel successful. I'm like, oh, thank you, Lord. Like, if Andy Crouch is saying that, now, granted, you're going to be a lot more productive and in your 24 minutes than I.
Depends on the day.
I was so blessed by that, and actually, it was incredible. It was a science. It was amazing. The 24 minutes you write, by the end, I'm halfway through a sentence. Yeah, the timer goes off, and I'm like, all right, I'm leaving it there. The creative juices are going. It's the cliffhanger. I'm just going to do some push-ups here, right? Jumping jacks, whatever. Yeah, and then when you get back, you're like ready to go on that one. Hopefully, that was super helpful. Yeah. So any of our listeners here who are in the process of trying to write, whether that's a paper for school, or whether that is a article you're working on, whatever it is, the 24/6 minute rotation is well worth it.
If there is one word that sums up the crisis of personhood in our time, for the powerful and powerless alike, it is loneliness. Like Ernest Hemingway's character who went broke gradually and then suddenly, modern people and societies have suddenly become acutely aware that we are relationally bankrupt. My life is full of convenience. It is full of transaction. At its best, a mutually beneficial exchange of value, a kind of arm's-length benign use of one another for our own ends. But it is not full of contemplation. It is often efficient, but it is lonely. My world is full of people, indeed more full than any human being before the last few crowded centuries could have possibly imagined, but it does not feel like a world of persons.
As we think in terms of personhood, you kick this book off with just making it abundantly clear that we have a systemic problem in our culture around what it means to be a person. And you put your finger on it right out of the gate. And you just say, this problem is loneliness. We are very, very lonely people.
Yeah.
And how would you describe loneliness for someone who's saying, am I lonely?
Well, I mean, the very first time I thought about this, I remember asking my friend Zach Narangia, who's now a bishop in the Church of Uganda, but back then he was just a pastor and leader. I said, Zach, when you visit the United States, what do you notice, that I might not notice? And he instantly said, oh, I notice how lonely it is.
Wow.
And then the interesting thing is that was probably 20 years ago. And since then, I've asked a number of friends from different parts of the world, especially the so-called developing world, the non-Western world, just when you visit the United States, what do you notice? They all say the same thing. They all use that word. I've probably had 5 different people from 5 different countries say that. So in some ways, I would actually say, I'm not sure any resident of America should trust themselves to self-diagnose the question you just asked. That is, am I lonely or not? Because we might be so swimming in a way of life that is isolated and isolating that we don't even know what it would be to not be lonely. I mean, obviously there's degrees of it, and we all have had moments where we feel there's no one looking for us. There's no one looking out for us. No one attending to us. And that's probably the essence of loneliness. And I think that's the difference between loneliness and aloneness or solitude. Because if you are in a good place in a sense, with God and the world, you can be alone and not feel unattended to, not feel cut off. And of course, conversely, you can be in the midst of a huge crowd and feel extremely cut off from personal recognition and attention. So, in that sense, I think, you are lonely if there's no one who knows at all what it's like to be you. No one who's trying to know what it's like to be you at this moment, or in this season of your life, or in this aspect of your life. You can be lonely in a particular aspect. Your life can be very full in one way, but there can be these dimensions where nobody knows what it's like to be you in this regard, you might say, and that can be lonely. But I think what my friend Zach and then the subsequent friends who have said this, who have observed this from different parts of the world, have reminded me is it's not just we as individuals who might pass through seasons of loneliness or even live long lives of loneliness. We live in a cultural environment that is structured to make it difficult to pay attention to other people and to regard other people and know what it's like to be other people. And, sorry, I'm going on and on here, but having visited Zach, whether it was when he said that or not, but having visited the country he grew up in, other parts of the world, and then you come back and you drive through a typical American suburb and you realize you can drive for miles and not see a human being who's not encased in steel and glass, in another car. And you go to these other parts of the world where people, realistically can't afford that. And if they could afford it, they'd probably want to live the way we live, at least at first, because there are appealing things about our way of life. But you go to a place where people mostly walk, mostly live in a neighborhood, mostly interact on foot, face to face. And you're like, oh yeah, if you just dropped into, suburban Philadelphia, you'd be like, where are the people?
Right.
And then we, stereotypically, at least, we pull into the, driveway. I literally saw someone, I was out on my bike a couple of days ago, saw someone do this, pulled into her driveway. You can see her hit the button on her little visor, the little dash, sun visor. And you know exactly what's going to happen. The garage door is going to roll up and her car is going to pull in, and then the garage door is going to close and she'll be encased in that house. And, no moment when she's even just out of doors, in the presence of creation. This is the world we've built,
Yeah.
So,
yeah. One of the illustrations you use in the book that I think is so striking on this is when you're talking about being in O'Hare in the airport. And you at one point decided you were going to go for a walk and have an exercise of acknowledging each person that you see is made in the image of God and that they're an image bearer. And that we're going to let that develop as people read the book. It's just a great portion to read, but that you've kind of carried that on at times and said you will choose to look around at people around you and just say image bearer, image bearer, image bearer, image bearer. And I particularly was struck by that when you were talking about, here's this person in a car who I'm seeing pass by me. Extremely easy to dehumanize that person, right? And yet I'm looking through the glass. I'm always surprised, actually, when I see a person behind a car and I think they look a certain way, and then if they get out of the car, man, they look so much different than I pictured them in the car, because there's distortion a little bit and all that. But here you are looking and just saying image bearer, and what does that mean? That was really striking. It was rooted first in the etymology of the word persona, the Latin word persona that you developed, and you talked about what that word actually means, like what it means to be a person. And so again, part of the contrast of what it means to actually be a person, and I'm looking at this person then as an image bearer of Christ versus, and then how would you say, what's on the other end of that for us? So, we might see this as a person made in the image of God if we're seeing things, ideally the way we should. But what's the other option that we tend to default into in seeing one another?
Here's one way to put it that ties together a couple of themes of the book. I think we start to see other people as robots. So that may sound weird. Like you're like, well, no, that doesn't sound right. But the word robot was coined by this Czech playwright, Karl Čapek, because he wanted to write a book about creatures who would look just like us, but would be manufactured rather than begotten to do the work that the human race didn't want to do. And so he wrote this play in the 1920s, I forget the exact year, called Rossum's Universal Robots. And no one had come up with a name for this kind of idea of humanoid. And in his play, they're not mechanical. They aren't like, they look like people. And of course they were played by people on the stage. They look like flesh and blood, but they're actually just manufactured. And so his brother suggested the word robot from the Czech word for serf, or you could say slave, certainly indentured, like bound servant is what robota means in the Slavic languages. And so I actually think when we don't see other people as image bearers, we see them as sort of less than human presences in the world whose importance to us is basically their utility to us. Their utility or their disutility. Oh, that stupid driver cut me off. In other words, that person had negative utility to my desire to get where I'm going. Or oh, isn't it nice? My Amazon package will arrive today. Now, that's a kind of disembodied way about speaking about a process that probably involved, I don't know, at least 4 or 5 human beings touched that package at different moments. But I can easily just think of it as I ordered a package from Amazon. Amazon delivered my package. And the fact that some of the touches were by mechanical robots, because they bought the robot manufacturer Kiva years ago. And so in their warehouses, there are all these little robots scurrying around, picking and pulling the thing I ordered. But, to the extent that for a while, maybe it was a mechanical robot that carried the package, and then a human being maybe carried it, and then maybe a human being got on a vehicle and drove it here. From my point of view, it's really doesn't matter whether it was mechanical or a human being, right? The package got delivered impersonally, without my ever having to know anyone, see anyone, interact with a person as a person. So I think when we don't, I think I quote in the book just one of the most profound sentences I ever heard uttered was uttered by a woman named Leanne Payne, who was a teacher of the spiritual life and of prayer. And she had this beautiful, challenging line: we either contemplate or we exploit. We either contemplate or we exploit. So I either am going to behold you as an image bearer, or I'm going to just basically ask, what good are you for me right now? Like, if I don't contemplate you first, I'm just going to jump right to the question of what good are you? Like, what can you do
Yes.
for me? And if you can't do anything for me, then you might as well, I'll just ignore you. I'll neglect you. And if you can do something for me, fine. But it's exploitation, not presence. It's not recognition. It's just insofar as you are useful. And that is exactly what we dream of having robots, because we dream of having highly capable intelligences in the world that all we need from them and all they demand of us is to be useful to us, if that makes sense, rather than that they would make a claim on us or would somehow need to be attended to and revered in their own right. No, wouldn't it be better just to have things that just worked for us, but with super high intelligence and very, very capable, but without the complication of being an image bearer?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm so glad you brought up that quote, because that quote was phenomenal, and really the way you kind of tease it out, that we're either contemplating or we're exploiting, and it begs a couple other questions from two sections of the book, and I think that from my perspective, when I first hear that one of the key things that we as humans need is to be seen and recognized by others. So when you talk about an infant who is just looking, searching, waiting for someone to find them, and that we as humans learn to identify our own persona, our own personhood, by being recognized by others. One of the questions that brings to mind for me, I think that while that is obviously true, when you say it, it's one of those things that you say, we probably should have known that, and I love this. Good writers do this. They have a way of bringing something into focus that I subliminally knew was true, and then it was like named and brought out, and it's like, oh man, that just resonates so deeply, of course. And yet there's a question that it begs for me. When we begin to identify ourselves based on how others view us. So I'm in the perception of someone else, they're seeing me a certain way, and I'm beginning to identify myself. But as Christian ministers, one of the things we do all the time is say, you are not who people say you are who God says you are, right? And so we need to see ourselves through the eyes of God. So what does it look like, Andy, as humans who struggle with loneliness and who need to be recognized by others, to say, I need others to see me, or we need to see one another? And I know you're not arguing for us to go looking for people to see us as much as you're inviting us to be agents of those recognizing others. You're asking us to be on the side of recognizing. But there's a question in there about, as vulnerable humans who need others, and yet also need the ability to be known outside of just the perception of others. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Wow. Yeah, that's so good. There's this, there's something in the background of this book that didn't make it at all into the book. I think for good reasons. I'm already trying to do too many things in this book, probably, but there's a whole area of political theory called the politics of recognition, and the sort of principal figures in it are a philosopher named Charles Taylor, who's a Canadian, and then Axel Honneth, who's a German, I believe, European philosopher of the 20th century, and both of them writing in different ways about how they feel like a lot of what's driven modern politics is actually the demand to be recognized, the demand to have your identity kind of affirmed. And they trace it through a series of movements in Western history. And there's some point to that. And there's some way in which it's right for the state, the nation state, to recognize people. But part of what's going on in this book is I'm actually, in a way, I was trying to write about the recognition that the state can't give and that you can't demand. A lot of demand for recognition is just essentially demand for affirmation of some aspect of who I am that hasn't been acknowledged or affirmed by other people. And the thing is, real relationship is way messier than that. So, as you said, like anyone who cares for the good of others we're not simply going to ratify everything we see in each other. We are going to push one another in various ways, or urge one another. I mean, is it Hebrews who says, spur one another on? Somebody says that in the Bible, spur one another on to love and to good deeds. In other words, you are bent away from love, and you're bent away from the good you were meant to do. And you need people who are going to if we take the metaphor literally, I don't know if it's there in the Greek, but it's there in the English metaphor. We're going to kick you in the side with a pointy thing. That's what a spur is. No, go this direction, go in the direction of love, go in the direction of the good you were meant to do. And, that's very different from the politics of recognition, which are basically just constitutionally, culturally, socially, legally ratify my existence, versus face to face in an encounter with another person. That person says, I both see what I do feel what it's like to be you. So you are not alone in that way, but I also envision something for you that isn't there yet. And I think that's what we have to be for one another. And I actually think it's the absence of those kind of formative communities that are driving the politics of recognition. It's the absence of having that in our homes and our families, our most formative communities like school and church, that as our world has become more lonely, ironically, the demands for recognition from the sort of the state, you might say, or from political entities, whether that's media or whatever, get louder and louder to cover up the lack of having actually been part of what in the book I would call a household, which is more than just family, that actually saw me and also saw what I could be, not just what I am or have decided I am. Does that make sense? I'm not sure it's exactly what you're asking about, but it is. Strikes me as important.
It's spot on. I really want to bring that around to, I was saying that when you were contrasting robot and person, that there was two parts of the book that drew me to. One is that ability to be recognized, but then, so being recognized by humans in a way that affirms that we're actually in the image of God. And then on the other side, you talk about how to live that in the midst of empire. And how we walk that out in the midst of empire. And one of the specific things that you talk about is how much of a call there is toward influence, using this word influence. And the way we talk about this, one thing about this book that of course resonates so deeply with us, Andy, you know how much we love we do church for church leaders. This is what we do. We think that pastors are constantly working in an environment, and church leaders in an environment where their relational contexts are their jobs. So it's very important to relate to people appropriately, to perform well in their relationship with people and their influence of people, but then them being able to relate to a group of people as an actual community where there's vulnerability and authority. It sounds like another book I read. And in that space that they can be known as humans, where they're able to be transparent and vulnerable enough to be known. And so part of what we do within Netzer is working to create communities among those Christian leaders to be able to be recognized by one another. And in the midst of that, when you were talking about how to live in the empire and talking about this word influence, and there's this danger, the way we talk about this is performance-based identity, and particularly when we get our mission in front of our purpose. So in the Christian evangelical world, if we're saying that the greatest call on humans is the Great Commission, I remember a certain Andy Crouch coming and speaking at one of our events that we had and said, well, that's fine if you start your Bible at Genesis chapter 3 and end it at Revelation 19. But but before the fall of man and after all things are made new, we still have a purpose. And when we live in a shrunken space,
Yeah.
there is a deep desire to be recognized and identified by how
Ooh.
well we're performing,
Yes.
rather than
Yes.
our pre-fallen creator saying, no, I've made you in my image,
Wow.
and having that space. So I think that when you're bringing all that together, what it is that was so compelling here is you use, and this is where I want to bring it back in, because I think this is right at the heart. Tell me if this is right at the heart of your writing, is this picture of Gaius and the community, that you have a first century picture of a home where people are being recognized, not for what their status is in society, not for how well they're performing, but because of who they are in the eyes of God. That this is the power place. Like, this is where it all fits. This is where, and I know that's what we're working on with these cohorts we have. But Andy, can you describe for us a little bit of what is the actual, like, what is going on in this household that's so powerful and that you're inviting people into?
Wow. Okay, actually, you're helping me put together a couple things that I hadn't quite figured out just from the last few days, actually. So just to set the table here, so Gaius would be the name of the host of a group of people that we glimpse in Romans 16, and I do write quite a bit about him and the other people who we find together in the house. We find out about just incidentally because of the greetings in Romans 16. And the question that I ask in the book is, what influence did they have in the end? I mean, and so the way this connects to empire, so I'm going to circle back around to that. I mean, to be in an empire, whether it's the Babylonian Empire, the Roman Empire, the Chinese Empire, the Empire of the Han, which is the longest running empire in human history at this point, or for that matter, the Pax Americana, that was kind of the 20th century, a 20th century empire of a sort, is to be surrounded by very, very clear examples of power at scale. In other words, when you are in an empire, the template for getting things done. It's the way Caesar gets things done. It's the way Xi Jinping gets things done. It's the way, pick your emperor. It's the way Nebuchadnezzar gets things done. And you are then tempted, what I would say tempted, invited to model your use of power on the way the emperor uses power. And this is very true in the first century, because it's so interesting to me. Like, there are some things about the providence of God that are just super fascinating. One is that God places his chosen people geographically in like the most vulnerable spot in the known world. Like, this little sliver of land, next to the Jordan River is like the worst place in geopolitical history to live, because every empire needs that little sliver of land to expand around the Mediterranean. And God says to his chosen people, here, have this tiny, not very defensible, vulnerable place where that Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Rome, Greece, etc., are all going to want to conquer. And then chronologically, so that's the geographical placement of the first redemptive people, Israel. The new Israel, chronologically, arises in the first century AD, or first century of the Common Era, which is the absolute pinnacle of the consolidation of the power of Rome. And for 3 or 4 more centuries, Rome is going to look like absolutely, this is how you get things done in the world. And you've got Augustus Caesar, who has a very unusually long reign. I think he reigns for I forget, it's almost 40 years, which is a long time for a Caesar. And he's incredibly effective. He consolidates power across the known world. And in Priene, which is now in Turkey, which is a Roman colony, the citizens, even I think before his 50th birthday, they've erected this inscription that says, "The birthday of the god Augustus was the beginning of the good news for the whole world." We uncovered this inscription a few decades ago. The beginning of the gospel for the whole world. So, of course, when Mark writes his gospel and begins it, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, he's directly quoting and inverting the Priene inscription, this language of, hey, This is really where good news begins. And he says, I want to tell you about a different son of God. And here's how this connects something I was just talking with my daughter. We're recording this the day after Easter Sunday, and in the church we were at together as a family yesterday, the gospel text was Mark's account of the resurrection appearance. And of course, the huge question about Mark is, did he really end his gospel the way it seems like he did? We have this late edition that doesn't seem authentic, and it's always in brackets in Bibles. And could it really be that late edition, if you take that off, what you have is the women fled and said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And it's even worse in Greek because it ends on the word for, the Greek gar, G-A-R, which is just this tiny little preposition that you never put it at the end of a sentence. You never put it at the end of a book, for goodness sake. Right. It's such a weak ending. It's such a lame ending. And my daughter's like, she's a senior in college. She has lots of her thoughts of her own. So it wasn't like a 3-year-old asking this question. She's like, so Dad, what do you make of the ending of the Gospel of Mark? So we had this really interesting conversation about it. But here's what I think is going on. If that's the original ending, and I'm in the school that thinks, yes, that's how Mark ended it. He ends it with the women. So the men are in hiding and the women are silent. Because he wants to say, I'm telling you the story of a truly different divine son. This is not Augustus Caesar style impact where you like ascend to power and boom, things start happening and the world starts changing. I want to tell you a story that literally, as his own account of Jesus has it, begins like a mustard seed. It begins so small and it's not impressive at all. The beginning of this story has nothing in it that is going to make you think, well, this is going to change the world. But in fact, it is. And that takes us back to Gaius and his home in Corinth, where Phoebe is there and Paul's there, and this scribe named Tertius is there. He's the one who wrote down their names. And this little group of people who can fit around a table and do fit around a table and share meals together, and the church that meets in Gaius's home and the church down the road that meets in Phoebe's home in Kenkrei, these are tiny gatherings of people that have no impact at all on their culture at this moment. But influence in terms of long-term, what has mattered most in the world, their lives, which were like a mustard seed, are now like, well, we're still talking about them here. Like they're influencing us. So when we think about our work as leaders, let's say, of the church, we have to recognize we live in technology's empire. Technology, just like Caesar did in his time, technology now gives us a template for what it means to matter, what it means to make a difference, what it means to have your life have meaning, and above all, really, essentially, what it means to have power. And Jesus, the way of Jesus, is just different. It's it doesn't immediately look. I mean, it can look like hiding in silence. And yet, if God's at work, and we believe God's at work, and we believe Jesus is risen from the dead, then this patient work of just recognizing one another, caring for each other, really knowing and being known, and then going out and doing that for other people and inviting them into that circle, that is the real work of the kingdom. And God's not going to neglect it or let it fall to the ground and not bear fruit. But man, it's hard to believe that when Augustus Caesar is, triumphing and running the show.
Man, it's hard to do that in a day of 1-day shipping. And it doesn't seem like quick work, man. Yeah.
A world of robots that do things for it. And we're like, oh, this is amazing. Well, but that's not going to be the template for the way the work of love grows. It's not.
Amen.
1-day shipping.
Yeah.
It's very ironic. Just as we were starting this interview, I desperately need a certain thing from Staples, the office superstore. And I ordered it on Instacart because today's very full and I got to have that thing. And so a whole bunch of robots while we're talking are doing the work. And, it'll be here by the time we're done talking, but that just cannot be. So that's useful. It's because I need to be productive today. There's a place for all this technology. It's basically to be productive. But in the environments that are formative and creative, we cannot afford to let technology give us the the marching orders of how we do what we do.
We do not have to accept our technology's default settings. They can be adapted and eventually redesigned to serve a new and better set of purposes. We do not have to live in ever-increasing isolation. Our homes, like Gaius's, can become creative centers far more consequential than the refuges of consumption and leisure we have let them become. And from these new households, we can begin to extend the recognition of personhood to those most in danger of being overlooked. The great news is that there are already examples of these redemptive moves, some seedlings, some saplings, some beginning to bear widespread fruit. And we all have a part to play in helping them grow.
And I got to tell you, Andy, I've just been leaning in a lot lately to Count Zinzendorf. And it reminded me so much of the story of Zinzendorf, which is a much closer to modern history. You know, it's in the 1700s, and here he is in Ernhout, and he's one of the wealthiest guys in Europe,
right?
And he's on a honeymoon with his wife in this vast property that he has, and he kind of wanders onto his grandma's property and comes across these Hussite refugees who were kicked out of Moravia, and he finds these refugees and he watches the way they're interacting with one another, and he realizes exactly what it is you're talking about. These people deeply know one another.
Wow.
And he gets jealous in the best sense of the word, and he says, I want to live with them. So he buys his grandma's property, sets up a home for them, builds a town called Ernhout, and they build this community there. And then he moves into the community, and he's often referred to as the rich young ruler who said yes, because he's like letting go of everything so that he can experience this community. And as he moves into this community, the most amazing things happens. There's this valet. He's a slave. His name's Anton Ulrich, and he's a slave of a Dutchman. And he comes to the community. Somehow Zinzendorf interacts with him, and he starts to hear the story of this guy about Africa and what it's like. And he brings him to the Ernhout community. And this guy Ulrich begins to share the plight of his people. And these Hussites are so struck by it that they're like, today we're making a decision to send missionaries to Africa.
Wow.
And 18% of the community mobilized for mission to go overseas to Africa in that moment. And they were, and all of this was in the midst of an enormous prayer meeting that lasted for 100 years. And it also was the birth of one of the greatest mission movements in history. And it was all because of this little community where they were being known. And I will say, it took 5 years of them trying to live out this community, and it was bloody hard for like 5 years, until there was an Anglican priest who I'm sorry, not an Anglican, a Lutheran priest who acknowledged how cool it was what they were doing and came and served them communion. And at that communion service is where the prayer meeting, the 100-year prayer meeting broke out, is when he was saying, this is awesome. And everything broke out. And after that, they said the whole thing switched. For 5 years, it was brutal. And after that, it just flowed.
And goodness.
And I was like thinking about, when I'm reading your stories of Gaius, I was thinking about Zinzendorf, and I was just like, oh, that's it. And that's in closer to modern history too.
Totally. This is the way, and this is the way that renewal movements happen over and over, with interesting differences of detail from time to place and time. But it is just, this is the way, and they can have huge, on one scale, no impact because good things just take time. But on other scales, obviously, I mean, the Moravians, and then of course Wesley, who was converted because of this movement, and the Methodists, over 100 years, a lot happens. So this is why I'm so I'm the furthest thing from hopeless about our current world and our technological world and the technological empire we live in, because we've seen it before. We've seen what happens, the renewal that can happen when really a very small group of people, albeit somewhat crazy people, say, we're just not living on the empire's terms. We're doing this other thing. And then crazy stuff begins to happen, and not the way Caesar works. And I think you and I have talked about this marvelous book by Alan Kreider, The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. And he talks about how, for 350 years, the church just grows patiently through the teaching of patience. And then Caesar, Constantine, becomes Christian. And Caesar's like, well, I can get things done a lot faster. And the kind of last part of Kreider's book is this sort of tragic reflection on what happens when Caesar decides to help the church out with his way of doing things, which is coercion and bureaucracy and dictates and law. And there's a place maybe for some of those things, and it's just very complicated, but you don't need Caesar to get the real thing done, and you don't need his way of doing things.
Man, I appreciate you name in the book that there's a temptation for us to trade our own personhood for power,
Yes.
because that's the lie that of that empire. That's the lie
right.
that we can have our superpowers and live very independent, and that the God of all that is the wealth, the mammon, everybody, you got to read the book. You just got to read the book. There's a lot there. There's a lot of really good stuff. Also, as you're reading that book, it reminded me particularly when you were talking about trading on power, I was like, yeah, but there's also this whole thing about redeeming power that Andy's written about, and playing God. And which, by the way, has been one of my, probably the book that I've read all of Andy's books and love all his stuff. You got to get Playing God. That's an awesome one. Someone that's so relevant for our world right now as well. So another one you got to jump into. I'm going to keep making plugs here for a minute, because for our family, we've used TechWise Family, and we've read TechWise Family with our children, listened to the audiobook of the most recent with Andy's daughter, Amy, who wrote and is called Being Raised in a TechWise Family.
It's called My TechWise Life. Yeah, My TechWise Life. Growing up and making choices in a world of devices. Yeah.
Yes, that's what it is. And so we listened to that together, an audio book, which was fun too. And so, hey, dive into this stuff. It's really helpful, as you all can tell from the interview today. This stuff is rich and important things for us to be diving into. Andy, before we wrap things up, one question that I want to ask you is, I want to get this personalized for people a little bit. When we're sitting, hanging out in your living room, having scones and tea and talking, we're also sharing personally what's happening with the Lord, what we're encountering personally. And one of the things that we like to do on the podcast is invite people to speak about a place where they've seen God at work. And it can be an early testimony of faith, or a place more recently where we've seen God in action, and just allow us as to be a little more humanized in our following of Christ. So are there anything that you could share with the listeners right now, a place where you've seen God at work that stands out, kind of personal to you?
I will share with you what I shared with my wife and my daughter yesterday, which is especially appropriate given Netzer and who Netzer serves. We've been through these 2 years of a lot of isolation, inevitably a lot of loneliness, certainly a lot of aloneness. And one of the forms of isolation has been isolation for so many people, from the church and the worship life of the church. In the past 4 weeks, I've had the great privilege of being in 4 different worshiping congregations in a way that I haven't been in 2 years because of the pandemic, largely. And these were in different parts of the country, very different places, one to the next. But I have seen the power of God's people kind of regathered after this pandemic season, where I don't know what the right thing was to do, but I certainly understand why we followed the dictates of why many churches followed the kind of prescriptions of this public health profession and so forth, and limited the way we gathered. In many parts of the country now, I mean, I was in San Francisco, I was just in Durham, North Carolina, and Chapel Hill, North Carolina. In many parts of the country now, we can regather the way that we did 2 years ago and for most of history. And the power of worship in a community that has been led to trust Jesus is just, it has been incredible just Sunday after Sunday to be back in that. And to see it in very different cultural contexts, very different kinds of places. And I was saying to my wife and daughter as we drove back from visiting our son in the Triangle area, Raleigh, Durham, Chapel Hill, for Easter weekend, I said, I feel like I really need to repent of having sort of lost confidence in the church as God's primary way of getting things done in the world. And of course, I hadn't changed my like theological position or my ecclesiology or anything, but I had just sort of lost heart, I think. And I just happen to have been in 4 places in the last 4 weeks that have completely rekindled my sense like this is the redemptive thing. Like all the other stuff, like writing Christian books or working for Christian nonprofits like I do, or all the parachurch things, which are legitimate things to do, I hope, because that's kind of what I do. They pale in comparison to the word, the sacraments, the power of the Spirit, song, like proclaiming aloud the goodness of God in the great congregation. And that's what we get to do on Sundays. And I know how hard it is. And I know that probably many people listening to this, like half your people have disappeared. Half of them refuse to come back from online. I mean, I've heard so many horrible stories, but I just want to say, like, I have been just in my own life, the fact that there are these congregations where people like the folks listening to this have just been faithful through 2 horrible years and have kept discipling people and caring for people and are still showing up to lead worship. It has completely rejuvenated my heart and soul and mind and strength to be in those gathered communities. So your labor in the Lord is not in vain. Do not lose heart. Don't grow weary in doing good, because what we get to do on the Lord's Day, there is nothing like it anywhere else in the world. And it's been such a gift to be in the weeks leading up to Easter, to see that expressed in very, very different kinds of churches. It's been a real, real gift.
Man, that's an awesome testimony. Thanks so much, Andy. Thanks just for your transparency in that as well. And I hope everybody who's listening is hearing that deep in your spirit right now. Your labor is not in vain, and you will reap a harvest in due season when you don't give up and you continue on trusting the Lord. So thanks so much, Andy, for being with us today. Thank you for those who are listening, tuning in. And we look forward to the next conversation with you, Andy. And hopefully the next conversation I have with you will, in fact, have scones.
Indeed.
And, yeah. And as we roll out too, I just also want to say, man, God bless you. Thanks so much for your work. The writhing on the floor, hoping for the inspiration to write the book. We're all recipients, and we're extremely grateful. Thanks, brother. It means the world to us.
Thank you, Tim.
The Lord is gracious and righteous and full of compassion. He protects the simple. He saved me when I'm low. Once more be at rest, oh my soul, for the Lord has been good to you. So every vow I have made, I will pay. Oh Lord, I'm your servant. With my offerings, I will give thanks, and I'll call on the name. Yes, I'll call